They ignored humanity's warning. Now the galaxy is burning. The translator light on my wrist was still blinking green when Velish looked at me with those pale silver eyes and said, "We appreciate the effort. Commander Solis, your report will be reviewed." I had crossed 9 light years to stand. In that room, I had been awake for 31 hours straight, running on cold coffee, and a kind of controlled dread that I had learned to use as fuel. I had rebuilt my entire presentation 3 separate times in the weeks before. This day, cutting anything that could be called dramatic, stripping every emotional appeal, keeping only the data. Because our diplomatic office had told me politely but firmly that the conclave responded best to precision. So I had been precise. I had been methodical and measured and careful. I had stood on the gray stone floor of the conclave chamber for 2 full hours. Without rushing, answered every question, offered and laid out everything I had found across 17 years of watching the dark at the edge of the galaxy. And Velish told me it would be reviewed. The galactic conclave chamber sat inside a rotating station above the gas giant. Valoris, a sphere of organized stone and glass and environmental technology that smelled faintly of salt and something older than salt, something I had never been able to name. The main auditorium held 400 delegates from 31 civilizations. The seating curved in wide arcs around the central floor, and the lighting shifted slowly between color registers as the environmental systems worked to keep every species physically comfortable at once. The Athari, who operated the station, preferred soft blue-white light and low humidity. The Kithra required elevate temperature. The Surai existed as a collective of gas and diffused light, contained in a tall sealed column near the back wall, completely present and completely unreadable. It was, under any other circumstances, one of the most remarkable places I had ever stood. I had stood there for 2 hours and told them the Vreth were coming, not as a theory, not as a possibility, as fact. Cold and dated and backed by 17 years of deep signal telemetry, survivor testimony collected from 3 destroyed colonies at the rim, acoustic profiles of dying star systems, and a mathematical pattern so clean and so consistent across so many data points that it did not leave room for interpretation. The Vreth were moving inward. They were moving deliberately and methodically. Every system they passed through went completely and permanently silent. I showed them the maps and the timeline overlays. I played the acoustic recording from Varoth colony, not a distress signal, just the sound of automated monitoring equipment registering the end of all biological activity in a star system and transmitting that fact into empty space. Because that was what the equipment had been built to do, because no one who built it had ever imagined needing it to do that. I displayed the signal decay curves from 7 other systems, all of them overlaid together, and showed the delegates how the curves matched each other within a margin too small to be natural variation. When I finished, a Kithra delegate, the 3rd row, clicked twice. My pre-mission briefing told me that sound meant either acknowledged or dismissed, depending on the speaker's posture and physical orientation. The delegate's posture gave me nothing at all to read. The Surai column at the back of the auditorium did not respond in any observable way. 2 junior delegates, one from the Orvan Assembly and one from a smaller species I recognized but whose name I will not attempt to render in standard asked. Clarifying questions. Both were careful, specific questions. That told me they were genuinely following the data. I answered both fully. The senior Athari representatives exchanged a look I could not interpret. Velish, leading the session from the elevated moderator's position, made a note on the surface in front of him. The only delegate who raised a hand with a real question, a question that showed he had been running the numbers in his head while I presented, was the young Orvan named Cadden. He was barely past his species, equivalent of 30, dark gray skin, wide amber eyes that attract every slide, and every data overlay with something that looked unmistakably like genuine attention, not the polite half-presence of someone enduring a presentation, the kind of attention that means a person is actually working. Commander Solis, he said, pattern analysis suggests the Vreth are advancing inward at an average rate of 2.4 light-years per cycle. At that rate, they reach the inner cluster in approximately 19 years. Is that correct? 18.7, I said, at their current pace. If they accelerate, which the data shows they have done on at least 2 previous occasions, the estimate drops to 12. Cadden wrote something down in a small notebook he kept on his knee. I watched him write and thought for one brief moment that maybe it would matter. Velish thanked me and explained that the formal report needed to go through Committee 7C, the subcommittee on unverified threat assessments, which met quarterly. The next session was 11 months away. I asked what it would take to convene an emergency session. 2/3 majority vote from member delegations, they said. I asked how many times in the conclaves 400-year history that had been achieved. The pause that followed lasted long enough to be its own answer. Velish moved smoothly to the next item on the agenda, and I walked off the floor and sat down in the observer section and looked at my hands for a moment before I trusted myself to look up. I flew home. From orbit, Earth looked exactly the way it always had, blue and white and alive, wrapped in its own moving weather, turning at its own pace without any awareness of or interest in what was happening at the rim. I pressed my palm flat against the viewport on the descent and let myself look at it for a long moment. All the people down there going about their lives, eating dinner, having conversations about things that mattered to them, going to sleep in beds that felt safe and warm. Not a single one of them had heard the Varoth colony recording. Not one of them knew what 17 years of watching had shown me. I wanted to keep it that way. That was the only reason any of this mattered. The first thing I did after landing, before I went home to the apartment I had not seen in 8 months, was go directly to Admiral Nora Grant at Earth Defense Command. Nora was 61 years old, gray-haired and sharp in the specific way that comes not from a natural gift for sharpness, but from 30 years of making decisions in environments where being wrong had a body count. She had the summary of my conclave presentation read before I had finished, settling into the chair across from her desk. She did not say reviewed. She said, "How long do we have?" I told her. I showed her the same maps, the same timelines, the same spiral pattern, the same acoustic profiles I had shown the conclave. I walked her through the methodology behind every conclusion so she would not have to take anything on faith. She pulled up a budget authorization terminal and began entering figures. She did not consult Committee 7C. She did not propose a working group or schedule a quarterly review. She read what I had brought her, asked 3 precise and completely practical follow-up questions, and made a decision. The way people make decisions when they understand that waiting has a cost that compounds. I went home that night for the first time in 8 months. The apartment was cold. The plants I had left with my neighbor were past any reasonable hope of recovery. I sat at the kitchen table in my coat, without turning on more lights, and ate instant noodles I found in the back of a cabinet and thought about Cadden in the back row of the conclave hall writing something down in a small notebook. I hoped he still had what he had written. I hoped he was paying attention to what happened next. Earth, in the meantime, was not waiting for permission. It was already building, quietly, without announcements, without asking anyone's authorization, in facilities that did not appear in any report filed with the conclave, and in training programs that existed under names that were accurate but not descriptive. Nora Grant had started something on a Tuesday morning 9 months before my conclave presentation, and she had kept it moving steadily through everything that followed. I did not know the full extent of it, yet I would find out in the weeks ahead. What I knew, sitting at my kitchen table in a cold apartment with dead plants, was that someone on Earth had read the preliminary report and decided that the absence of a 2/3 majority vote was not a reason to do nothing. That was enough for that night. I slept for 11 hours. When I woke up, I went back to work. I filed the first follow-up report to Committee 7C 7 weeks after the conclave presentation. 43 pages of new material, including confirmed spectral data from a 4th star system at the outer rim that had gone silent since my presentation day. The committee sent an automated acknowledgement of receipt. Nothing further arrived. The second follow-up 6 weeks after that, and assembling it had cost me 4 consecutive sleepless days because I had discovered something that changed the shape of everything I had previously understood. The Vreth were not moving through systems in the order that a simple linear trajectory would produce. They were spiraling. The silence spreading across the rim followed a deliberate inward curve, tightening with each cycle of movement. The geometry of it precise and consistent and unmistakably intentional. Across 22 separate systems over 9 years of data, this was not a species expanding opportunistically through open space. This was a program executing toward a destination. I used the word urgent 4 times in the subject header. I requested expedited review. I attached a 1-page summary, specifically designed for a reader who might only look at the first page and nothing else, with the core conclusion stated in the first sentence and the supporting data organized by decreasing order of impact. Committee 7C responded 3 weeks later. The letter thanked me for my continued diligence, noted that the current docket was at capacity, informed me that my supplementary materials had been added to the file for the upcoming quarterly session, and wished me well. I stared at that letter until the words stopped registering. Then I filed a formal petition for an emergency session citing evidence of directional and programmatic threat movement that constituted a material change from the original assessment. A petition required signatures from 6-member civilizations to be considered. I contacted the diplomatic offices of 9 species, drafting separate versions of my request tailored to each audience. 4 did not respond at all, not even with an automated acknowledgement. 3 declined, each citing insufficient evidence to justify disrupting the scheduled proceedings, though none of them specified what additional evidence would be sufficient or how I might go about obtaining it, while the system that could authorize an investigation refused to convene. The Orvan Assembly, which included Cadden, sent a 3-page official response that had clearly been written by someone who had read my reports carefully and understood them. It was sympathetic in tone, specific its engagement with my data, and completely prevented by internal counsel constraints from signing the petition at this time. It expressed sincere hope that the situation would resolve positively. 2 signatures came through. One was from the Orvan Assembly's junior diplomatic liaison, not from the assembly itself. The signature directly contradicted his government's official position, and it almost certainly cost him something internally. He sent it without explanation or comment, just the signature and a timestamp. I never learned his full name, and the records from that period are incomplete on this point. I have thought about him many times since. The other signature came from a small, newly admitted species called the Droven, whose home world sat at the edge of the expanding silence. Their lead diplomat, a woman named Petra, included a handwritten note written in careful, formal standard. We believe you, Commander. We have been watching our outer relay stations go dark for 2 years. Now, nobody from the Conclave has asked us why. We signed because someone should have signed earlier. I needed 6 signatures. I had 2. The petition was denied. While the petition process occupied weeks of my time and produced nothing, I kept making trips north. Nora Grant brought me into the Highland facility every 3 weeks, and every visit she showed me something new. First visit, a completely redesigned drive configuration for our deep rain cruiser fleet, transit time to the outer rim cut by 30%. I asked how long the redesign had taken. She told me they had started it before my conclave presentation. They had started it before my preliminary report reached committee. 7C. Second visit, a weapon system built from the ground up, not adapted from existing designs, built specifically from my analysis of Vreth vessel geometry, energy signatures, and observed movement behaviors, built to engage something that fought the way the data said the Vreth fought, not the way any previous adversary had ever fought. Third visit, a training program. Nora showed me the simulation results without preamble, pass rates, scenario breakdowns, failure analysis, and then the rebuilt protocols that had come out of those failures, and then the new results after the rebuilding. I looked at the numbers for a while, then I asked how many crews had completed the full program. She told me the number was much larger than I had expected. I asked when they had started. She told me that too. They had started the training program before my conclave presentation. They had started it based on my preliminary report, the one filed 9 months before the presentation, the one that had also Gone to Committee 7C and received no response. Nora Grant had read that preliminary report on a Tuesday morning, called 2 officers into her office by the end of the afternoon, and started something she did not give a public name to and did not seek external approval for. Someone had to take it seriously, she said. I asked if the conclave knew any of this was happening. She looked at me over her coffee cup for a moment. They didn't ask, she said. I kept filing a request for joint reconnaissance to gather live data on Vreth position and behavior at the rim. Returned pending completion of Committee 7C review. A formal inquiry asking whether the Droven's 2 years of relay station data could be incorporated into the official threat assessment. Acknowledged, not acted upon. A request to bypass the committee system entirely and present updated findings directly to the Security Council. Returned with a letter explaining that Security Council presentations required endorsement from a recognized regional bloc, and no regional bloc had come forward to provide one. There was a particular quality to being denied something you had built carefully and correctly. It was not like failing. Failure comes with feedback, something you can learn from and adjust. Being denied by a system that had simply not looked was different. It was like trying to open a door that was not locked, just very heavy, held shut by the accumulated weight of process and precedent and the general preference of large institutions for not changing how they operate until the cost of not changing becomes unavoidable. I filed the denial in my records and moved forward. I was not surprised by any of it. I had moved through frustration months earlier and arrived somewhere quieter, focused, functional stillness that I did not have an accurate name for. The internal state of a person who has fully accepted that noise and escalation are not the right tools and has committed completely to doing everything else. Instead, I organized my data more carefully. I built better predictive models. I documented every anomaly I found, no matter how small, because I had learned that small anomalies are where patterns begin. I also started paying attention to a different kind of information, not just sensor data from the rim, but the structure of how the conclave itself made decisions. I read 400 years of session records. I mapped which species had historically voted together, which had opposed each other, which had remained consistently neutral, and under what conditions any of them had ever shifted position. I was looking for the architecture of the problem, because understanding why something was failing was the only way to find a part of it that was not yet broken. What I found was not encouraging. The committee system had been designed in good faith to prevent hasty decisions by a body representing dozens of species with conflicting interests. It was well suited to exactly that purpose. It was structurally incapable of responding to anything that moved faster than a quarterly schedule, which meant it was well suited to managing disputes and not suited at all to addressing active threats. Nobody had built it with a scenario like this in mind, because in 400 years of conclave history, no scenario like this had arisen. The committee system had worked perfectly for 4 centuries, and it was now precisely the wrong tool. Knowing this did not give me a to change it, but it gave me a clearer target, and a clearer target is always worth something. I also developed a new long-range Detection method with a young signal. Analyst named Gwen who had a talent for acoustic processing that made my own. Techniques look preliminary. Together, we rebuilt the detection protocol from scratch and extended its effective range by a factor of 3. Gwen was 26 years old and furious in the way that genuinely capable people become. Furious when they understand something important and cannot get the people with authority to see it. She reminded me, sharply and somewhat uncomfortably, of who I had been at her age. I did not tell her that. I did not want to suggest that her frustration was something she should expect to carry for the next decade and a half. I wanted her to stay angry, and I wanted her to stay in the work because people who are angry about the right thing and disciplined enough to channel it productively are rare, and I needed her. Cadden and I exchanged messages every few weeks. He was careful in what he put in writing. He was a junior delegate, and his official communications traveled through monitored channels, but he wrote back every single time. He read everything I sent. He caught a rounding error at the third decimal place of my spiral pattern calculation, a small imprecision that did not change any conclusion but would have given a hostile reader an easy dismissal target. He sent me a quiet note about it. I corrected the file and filed an amended version without making any announcement about the correction, which was the right way to handle it. I asked him once carefully whether there was any private movement inside the conclave, any shift in how senior delegates were discussing the outer rim situation when the official sessions were not running. He was quiet for 2 weeks. When he wrote back, he was clearly choosing each word with precision. There are conversations, he said, but not the kind you are hoping for. The dominant view among senior delegates is that humanity's concern is genuine, but that it is being amplified by characteristics specific to your species, that humans have a heightened threat response because of your brief tenure in galactic society, and that you are reading urgency into data that civilizations with longer perspective would interpret more calmly. Velish said this at a private session last month. I was not supposed to be present. I was there anyway, and I heard it clearly. I sat with that message for a very long time. I thought about the Vareth colony recording playing in an empty committee office. I thought about Petra from the Drovan diplomatic office watching relay stations go dark for 2 years while nobody asked her why. I thought about the spiral in my data, tightening methodically inward, patient in the way that things are patient when they have no concept of patience, because hurrying has simply never been necessary. I thought about what it would actually take to move ancient civilizations to act on something they had not yet seen directly. And then I thought about the Highland facility and the crews running simulations in the dark, and Nora Grant at her terminal on a Tuesday morning, deciding that the absence of a majority vote was not a reason to stop. 14 months after my presentation to the conclave, the colony on Vareth IV went silent. Vareth IV was not at the rim. It was 11 light years from the Kithra home system. Committee 7C sent a message requesting a follow-up meeting. The Kithra home system fell in 4 days. I know how that reads. The mind immediately reaches for something visible, fire, noise, the kind of destruction you can photograph or put in a broadcast, but that is not what happened. The planets were all still there. Their sun still burned exactly as It had burned for billions of years. Before any of this, every piece of orbital infrastructure the Kithra had, built across 8,000 years of civilization, still functioned precisely as designed. The stations ran their environmental systems. The navigation beacons broadcast their signals, the automated atmospheric monitors on 17 worlds collected and transmitted data to servers that were still online and still receiving it. Everything worked, nothing remained that could use any of it. The first signal came from a Kithra deep range outpost 2 light-years from the home system. It was a routine automated status report, formatted and transmitted at its scheduled interval, indistinguishable from the 1,000 previous reports that had preceded it except for a single notation in the final data packet. Contact with the inner system had been lost. The report was factual and calm and entirely without alarm because it had been written by a machine that had no capacity to understand what it was reporting. The second signal came from a colony ship that had been in transit between 2 of the outer Kithra worlds when the inner system fell. The captain's name was Orin. He was the first non-human I had ever heard break down in the way that loss breaks people, the sudden and complete failure of composure that comes when the mind finally stops refusing to accept something true. He described the sensor readings normal, and then silence, and then a quality of nothing that is different from ordinary absence, in a voice that kept stopping mid-sentence because his body understood what had happened before the rest of him could reach the words for it. I was aboard the Earth vessel ESV Harrow. When both signals arrived, the Harrow was a mid-range patrol cruiser, fast and quiet and stripped of any equipment that was not operationally necessary. She had been sitting at the edge of effective sensor range near the outer rim for 6 weeks, doing exactly what the Conclave had declined to authorize as a joint mission, because doing it without authorization was better than not doing it at all. Our captain was Gregory Falk, 44 years old, lean, precise in everything from his speech to his movements, with a face that gave away nothing even when his hands were moving quickly through control sequence. When the Kithra signals came through, he called me to the bridge and put the sensor feed on the main display and waited for me to read it without saying anything first. I looked at the data, I looked at the heading indicators. They have changed direction, he said. The Vreth advance which had followed the inward spiral I had mapped for years had shifted. They were no longer following the spiral trajectory. They were moving laterally, and their new heading was clear, toward Ethari space. How long? I asked. Gregory pulled up the projection without being asked. 8 days to the outer Ethari boundary. Current speed. I opened a channel to Earth Defense Command. Nora Grant answered in 14 seconds. It was 3:00 in the morning at her location, and she sounded like someone who had not slept, which meant she had already seen something. I transmitted the data packet. She was quiet for about 30 seconds, reading. Fleet coordination, she said. Full. Packet emergency flag right now. I asked about the Conclave. I contacted their crisis office 2 hours ago, she said. Emergency session. Passed with 30 votes. Losing the Kithra was enough for a majority, it turns out. I said nothing to that. There was nothing useful to say. Yara, she had never used my first name. In 3 years of working together, come back to Earth. I need you here. Things are moving now. The Conclave's emergency session produced a formal statement of galactic concern, a motion establishing a joint defense coalition and 3 new subcommittees to handle the details of the coalition's formation. The motion passed unanimously. The subcommittees convened immediately. They discussed the question of command hierarchy for 6 hours and then agreed to table the question and take it up at the next session. I read the session transcript twice on the flight home. I read every word of it. Our fleet was already moving. No subcommittees, no proposals, no hierarchy debates, moving orders going out from the Highland facility to ships that had been waiting for orders for 2 years, and those ships responding immediately because the crews had run this specific scenario in simulation enough times that receiving the actual order felt familiar. I landed and went directly from the transport pad to the situation room without stopping, still wearing travel clothes, bag in my hand. Nara was at the display table with 4 senior officers and a wall of live data behind her. She pointed at a section of the display. Vreth entered the Athari outer boundary 2 hours ago. The Athari fleet had been there to meet them. The Athari fleet was extraordinary in every measurable way. 10,000 years of active space engagement had produced something that went beyond skill into something closer to art. They're moved with a precision and responsiveness that our engineers had studied in open admiration for decades. Their commanders had seen conflicts that humanity had not yet existed to witness. Their doctrine had been refined across a span of history that made our own military tradition look like a brief opening chapter. They were also built entirely for adversaries who communicated intent before they struck. Every piece of Ithorian tactical doctrine assumed an enemy who made pre-engagement maneuvers that could be read, who gave you information, who followed the logic of threat and counter-threat that every known civilization in the galaxy had developed over centuries of conflict with each other. This assumption was not naive. It was correct for every adversary they had ever faced across 10,000 years of recorded history. The Vreth did not signal. They did not maneuver in ways that communicated anything. They moved toward a target and applied force at the weakest accessible point, immediately and without the pre-engagement period that every defense system in the galaxy was built to respond to. The Ithorian repositioned 6 times in the first hour. Each reposition was the tactically correct response to the situation as their training allowed them to understand it. They were executing their doctrine exactly as intended. They were not making errors. They were doing everything right for an adversary that fought the way adversaries were supposed to fight. The Vreth moved through their formation the way water moves through fingers that are slightly open. By the time I reached the situation room, the Ithorian outer fleet had been reduced by 60%. Henry Cole was standing at the display table. He ran tactical operations and had overseen the simulation program for 2 years, and he was looking at the Ithorian engagement data with the specific expression of someone watching a predicted thing happen in reality and finding the reality almost exactly as bad as the prediction. They targeted the command vessels first, he said. exactly the way the pattern analysis suggested they would. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a moment. How long were you watching them before you took the report to the conclave? 17 years, I said. He turned back to the display. Tell me everything you know about how they select a target, all of it. We talked for 4 hours. Outside the windows, the Highland sky moved from full dark through gray into a pale cold morning. There were 9 people around the table. In total, Henry and 3 of his tactical officers, Nora, 2 analysts I had not previously met, and me. We worked through the Ithorian engagement data point by point, overlaying what we knew about Vreth, targeting behavior against what the sensor records showed. Each overlay made the picture sharper and more specific. The Vreth had not attacked randomly or by obvious size metrics. They had identified the Ithorian command structure with precision, moved to sever it first, and then treated the surviving fleet as a series of isolated targets, rather than a unified force. Every command vessel had been neutralized before the Vreth shifted attention to the outer fleet. The Ithorian had not been defeated in detail. They had been decapitated first, and then addressed in sections. This matched every other engagement in the historical record. What the combined sensor data now showed clearly for the first time was the speed of the targeting decision. The Vreth had processed the command structure identification and committed to a targeting sequence faster than our models had projected. Not dramatically faster. The difference in raw numbers was not alarming on its own, but in engagements decided by margins measurably faster is the difference between a plan that executes as designed and one that only works on paper. Henry flagged it before anyone else finished reading. He pulled up the closest comparable scenario from the simulation library and ran a revised projection in real time, 11 minutes. The revised timeline was not comfortable. It was not unworkable either, but the margin we had built into the execution plan had just become narrower. We need to adjust the timing on the initial engagement, he said. He gave the specific figure. Nora looked at the number, then at the map of the passage on the wall showing every fleet asset in transit. Do it. Get the revised parameters to all fleet commanders within 3 hours. Henry was already entering it. An analyst named Claire who had said very little through the first 2 hours of the session spoke into the quiet that followed. We have been building toward this specific engagement for 2 years. She said, the revision changes the timing. It does not change the core. The core is sound. Nobody disagreed with her. She was right. 2 years of genuine preparation, built on real data, rebuilt after every failure, was not going to be unmade by a timing adjustment. Henry's revision would sharpen the execution. The execution itself had been built to survive exactly this kind of late information because we had always known that late information was what we would have. On the other side of the galaxy, the Ithorian were losing something that 10,000 years had built piece by piece, engagement by engagement. In the room, we were building something, too, not elegant, not ancient, assembled from data and patience and people who had decided that the absence of authorization was not the same as the absence of necessity. The coalition subcommittees were still working on the command hierarchy. Question: our fleet had already received its Orders. We were going to the Surai Passage and we were going ready for what was waiting. There, I arrived at the Surai Passage aboard the ESV Harrow 17 hours before the Vreth. 17 hours is not as much time as it sounds when there is work to do, and there was a great deal of work to do. We used every minute of it. Gregory Falk ran the Harrow with the kind of precision that comes from months of sustained preparation, the quiet, practiced efficiency of a crew who had rehearsed this specific situation in simulation enough times that every station rotation and systems check ran from memory without prompting. There were no speeches, no one said anything memorable or inspiring. People moved to their positions, verified their systems, communicated in short and accurate sentences, and worked. I had a station on the secondary bridge with a monitor array and a communications terminal positioned to track the tactical picture and relay information between our command and the coalition forces that were arriving and organizing nearby. The Surai Passage was a narrow corridor of navigable space between two dense stellar clusters. Its strategic value was straightforward. It was the fastest available route from the Ithorian territories into the inner cluster. If the Vreth continued on their heading, they were coming through it. We had flagged the passage as a priority position 14 months earlier during planning sessions in the Northern Highlands as part of a list of 32 locations where a conflict was most likely to occur. We had prepared operational plans for all 32. We had run the Surai Passage scenario in simulation over 200 times, adjusting and rebuilding the plan after each failure, until the failure rate fell below a threshold we considered acceptable. Nothing about the next 17 hours was improvised. The Surai fleet arrived 4 hours after us. Their remaining vessels, those that had escaped the Ithorian engagement, came to the passage without waiting to be asked. Their lead admiral opened a communications channel almost immediately after arriving and requested to speak with whoever commanded the Earth forces. Gregory took the call at the primary bridge. I listened from secondary. The translation software rendered the Surai Admiral's words in careful standard. We have been told your people have studied the enemy in depth. We would like to know what you know. Gregory said, we will share everything we have. And he meant it exactly as stated. Within the hour, our complete tactical database was being transmitted to the Surai fleet in full. Every operation model, every simulation result, and failure analysis, every observation note, every update Gwen and Henry and I had produced across 2 years of preparation. At the same time, Gwen, who had traveled separately and arrived aboard a second vessel, was working directly with a Surai data specialist to cross-reference their sensor recordings from the Ithorian engagement against our existing models, looking for anything that would sharpen what we already thought we knew. The data sharing took 3 hours and produced several things we had not anticipated. The Surai had recorded the Ithorian engagement from a distance, and their sensor equipment operated on different frequencies from ours, which meant their recordings captured aspects of the engagement that our existing data had not. When Gwen and the Surai specialist overlaid the two data sets, the combined picture was more complete than either one alone. What it showed was something that adjusted our timing estimate slightly. But significantly, the Vreth recalculation period, the pause we were counting on, was shorter against a coordinated response than our simulations had shown against uncoordinated defenders. Against the Ethari, who had repositioned 6 times in organized formations, the Vreth had recalculated faster than our baseline model predicted because the coordination itself gave them a cleaner pattern to calculate against. This was important. It meant our engagement window was narrower than we had planned for. Gwen brought me the revised estimate 40 minutes before the Vreth arrived. She did not apologize for the adjustment or soften it. She stated it clearly and added that she had already updated the engagement parameters for every Vreth in the formation. I took the revised estimate to Gregory. He read it. He made 3 changes to the execution plan without discussing them with anyone because they were changes within his operational authority, and taking time to discuss them would cost more than making them. Then he went back to flying the ship. I went back to my station and looked at the revised numbers and thought about how many times we had run this in simulation and how the simulation had not known about the Surrey data and how the gap between what you model and what actually happens is always exactly this. Something you did not know to include. Discovered at the last moment, narrowing the margin you had built for yourself. The margin was still there. It was smaller than it had been 2 hours ago. It was still there. What they confirmed was something Henry Cole had been arguing for 8 months in planning sessions I had only partially attended. He called it mechanical confidence. The Vreth were highly effective against adversaries who responded in ways their calculation had accounted for. They were not adaptive in the way that a thinking opponent is adaptive. They calculated, committed, and executed without deviation until the engagement or new information forced a full recalculation against opponents whose response fell within expected parameters. They were nearly impossible to stop. Against responses that fell outside those parameters, they paused. The pause was measurable. It was finite. In simulation across hundreds of different scenarios, the pause existed and could be exploited if you were positioned to exploit it before the recalculation completed. No civilization had ever survived contact with the Vreth long enough to test this observation against reality. We were about to. The Vreth arrived at the outer edge of the passage 17 hours and 4 minutes after the Harrow. They came on the exact vector our models predicted, at the exact speed our models predicted, in a formation that matched our projections closely enough that Henry, watching from the tactical center on the lead ship, did not say anything at all when the sensor feed confirmed it. He simply nodded once. I heard about this later from someone who was standing next to him. 11 vessels, gray-brown and roughly oblong, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that has never developed the habit of doubt. They broadcast nothing. They announced nothing. They entered the passage the way a hand enters empty water, because in all of their experience, no apparent emptiness had ever turned out to be something else. We let them come in. This was the part of the plan that demanded the most from every crew in the formation, because every instinct, every piece of conventional training, every doctrine that any civilization had ever developed said that you meet an incoming threat at the boundary, you show force. Early, you give the adversary the opportunity to evaluate and potentially redirect. This approach is not irrational, it is correct for adversaries who think, who adapt, who change their behavior based on what they see. The Vreth did not change behavior based on what they saw. They scanned, calculated, and executed, meeting them at the boundary would hand them the precise information they needed to make that calculation accurately, so we gave them something else instead. Our formation inside the passage looked, from their sensor perspective, like a loosely organized collection of vessels, lacking coherent command structure. We had designed it specifically to appear that way. The arrangement was intended to present a series of what appeared to be individual, uncoordinated targets rather than a unified defensive force with a center worth striking first. We had run this configuration in simulation hundreds of times, and we knew exactly what it would register as on an incoming scan and what conclusion an adversary that relied on calculated targeting would draw from it. The Vreth spent 4 minutes on their scan. Then they moved toward the largest visible target in the formation, the ESV, steadfast, positioned at the center, along the most efficient available path. That path led them through the engagement range of 7 vessels that had been holding position completely silent. Gregory Folk's voice came across the command channel. All units execute. 11 minutes. I watched it on the monitor array. I'm not going to tell you I was calm through it because that would not be accurate. My hands were pressed flat on the edge of the console and my breathing was not steady, and somewhere in the second minute Gwen, whose station was positioned directly beside mine, put her hand briefly on my arm without saying a word. She kept it there for about 5 seconds and then took it back. That 5 seconds kept me present in the room when part of my mind was trying to go somewhere else. Our ships did not fight the way the Vreth's calculation expected anything to fight. We did not move to defend the steadfast. We did not consolidate into a protective perimeter around it or do anything else that a defending force with a clear center would logically do. Every vessel in the formation shifted simultaneously, each one moving to a position that had been precisely calculated in advance to intercept a specific element of the Vreth formation at the specific moment, when that element would be committed to a heading and not yet positioned to respond effectively to a threat arriving from an unexpected angle. There was no command ship to protect. There was no hierarchy to disrupt. We were not playing the engagement the Vreth understood, because we had spent 2 years designing a completely different engagement and then practicing it until every crew member could execute their piece of it accurately in degraded conditions under pressure on reduced power with communications interference, because those were the conditions we expected to be operating in, and we had built the plan around reality rather than ideal circumstances. The Vreth recalculated. They were capable of it. Methodical is not they same as rigid, and they were not stupid. They began adjusting their formation in response to what we were doing. While they adjusted, our fire was already accounting for where the adjustment was going to take them, because we had simulated every available recalculation path 947 times, and we knew which ones the calculation would find most viable and how long each one took to execute. We lost 2 ships. the ESV Callaway and a Surai vessel, whose name the translation software rendered as something like the deep. Current 3 members of the Harrow's crew were injured, our secondary drive systems took enough damage that we ran the final 3 minutes of the engagement on emergency power, and Gregory flew the Harrow on emergency power with exactly the same precision and the same flat, controlled voice he used on full systems. I watched him work. I have not forgotten it. Of the 11 Vreth vessels, 4 were destroyed and 3 were disabled. 4 stopped. I need you to understand what that means. In 400 years of galactic conclave, records across every account of every recorded encounter between any civilization and the Vreth, they had never stopped mid-engagement. They had never paused. They had never done anything except move toward the next target in the sequence until the engagement resolved one way or the other. There were no accounts, not one, of the Vreth encountering something unexpected enough to halt their execution entirely. They stopped. Gregory's voice even controlled. Hold position. All units hold and report status. The reports came back from across the formation. The Surai vessels in the outer flanking positions reported minimal damage. I looked at the tactical display and at the 4 motionless gray-brown ships on it, and I did not move for a moment. 11 ships had come in. 4 stopped, 3 disabled, 4 gone. 2 of ours gone. The Callaway had a crew of 61. I did not have the names yet. The names would come in the formal reports over the days that followed, and I would read everyone, and I would keep everyone, not because I was required to, because the names are the honest accounting, and honest accounting is the thing that keeps you from letting the next preparation fall short. The Surai Admiral opened a channel 2 hours after the engagement ended. Your people fight in a way we have not seen before. Gregory looked across the bridge at me. I walked over and stood beside him at the communication station. We had time to prepare, I said into the channel. A pause. How much time? 17 years, I said. The translation from the Surai side came through slowly. The Admiral was choosing words carefully. Then the warnings were real. I closed my eyes for a single breath. Yes, I said, they were real. The channel stayed open for a while. After that, neither side said anything further for several minutes. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 groups of people who had just been through something together and did not yet have the right words for it, and who understood that reaching for the wrong words would diminish it. Eventually, the Surai Admiral said, "We would like to know how to build what you have built." "We will show you everything," Gregory said. "Everything we have, all of it." This was the same thing he had said hours earlier when they asked to know what we knew, and he meant it the same way both times, completely and without reservation. In the weeks that followed, it would be the most important thing said in any communication during that period. Not any tactical insight, not any particular piece of data, just the willingness to open the library entirely and hand it over without conditions. Other species came to the passage in the days after the engagement. Some came because they had heard what happened and wanted to understand it. Some came because their home worlds were in the path of the Vreth's redirected heading, and they had nowhere else to go. The Orvan Assembly sent a formal fleet commitment within 48 hours. Cadans Message accompanying it was 3 sentences long and entirely without political language. The Vreth redirected 3 days after the engagement, not a retreat, a recalculation. The cost of the passage had exceeded what their process was willing to pay. They moved toward quieter edges, toward systems with smaller resistance. We followed them there, and 17 other species eventually joined the effort. And the 3 years that followed were the hardest sustained work of my life, and at the end of them, the inner cluster was still standing. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. The Vreth did not come back to the Sura passage. I want to be precise about what that means, because the easy version of it loses the thing that actually matters. They did not break. They did not retreat in the way that living, thinking beings retreat, carrying the weight of what happened, changed by it, making different choices because of what it cost them. The Vreth do not carry weight from one engagement to the next. They do not lie awake processing what went wrong. They recalculate. The cost of continuing through the passage had exceeded the value their process assigned to it, so they redirected to places where the cost was lower. That is the complete and accurate account of what happened. There is no additional layer of meaning beneath it. They moved toward quieter edges, toward civilizations with smaller fleet, less preparation, younger histories. They moved toward the parts of the galaxy that had not spent 17 years building toward this specific moment. We followed them. And this is the part of the story that gets compressed in every formal account I have read, because sustained effort across 3 years does not have the clean shape of a single decisive engagement. And human beings, and it turns out most other species as well, find sustained effort much harder to hold in memory than a moment of crisis. So let me be specific about what those 3 years actually contained, because the specific truth is the only thing that makes any of this useful going forward. We shared everything we knew with every civilization that would take it, not summaries, not overviews designed to protect our methods, everything. Complete tactical databases, simulation, libraries, failure analyses, detection, protocols. We sent teams to work directly with species who were integrating our methods into their own defense planning, and who needed help translating approaches designed for human crews into something their own people could run effectively. We adapted, we revised. We learned things from the Surai and the Orvan and the Drovan that we had not known, and that made our own approach better. Gwen ran the long-range detection work through all 3 years without stopping. She expanded the sensor network into sectors we had never monitored and trained specialists from 6 different species and the acoustic signature methods we had developed together. And by the end of the 2nd year, those specialists were running their own monitoring operations independently, without any input from us, and doing it well. She built something that would outlast both of us and continue working after neither of us was in the room anymore, which is the only kind of work that actually solves the problem, rather than just responding to the latest instance of it. A Drovan admiral named Gilbert came to our attention about 6 months into the broader effort. He was an older man, quiet in the way that people who have watched something frightening for a long time become quiet, and he had spent 3 years watching his people's outer stations go dark and developing entirely on his own, and without access to any of our data, defensive thinking that matched our own conclusions in several critical areas. He and Henry Cole began arguing strategy over encrypted communications channels almost immediately after they were introduced, and the arguments were among the most productive exchanges in the entire 3-year effort because they were both right about different things and both honest enough to say so out loud. We lost people. I'm not going to list every engagement because this account is not a military record, and that is not where its value lies. What I will say is that the Surai Passage was not a template that repeated cleanly in the engagements that followed. Some operations went exactly as planned. Others went wrong in ways that our models had not predicted, and in those moments we paid the cost of being wrong. And the cost was real and carried faces and names that I still know. I kept a complete record of every name, not because I was required to, because snorts, those names are the weight you have to carry to stay honest about what the work actually demands. And honesty about cost is the thing that prevents the next preparation from being less than it needs to be. By the end of the 3rd year, the Vreth had pulled back to the far edges of the galaxy, still present, still moving in the spaces between stars, still executing whatever internal process drives them, still doing what they do in regions that are not the inner cluster, but no longer advancing toward us. The thing we had collectively built and sustained and held across 3 years had raised the cost of the inner cluster past the threshold their calculation was willing to pay. That is what victory looks like in a situation like this. Not a moment, not a defeat that ends the threat forever. Threshold, a raised cost, a galaxy that is not burning today because the people who built the wall built it before the fire arrived rather than after. I understand that this is less satisfying than a cleaner ending. I have made my peace with that. The Galactic Conclave held a formal session 4 months after the passage engagement, while the broader effort was still running. They invited me to attend as a guest, with a front row seat in the same auditorium where Velish had told me my report would be reviewed 3 years before. Velish was not in the room. I did not ask anyone about his absence. The session was different from anything the Conclave had produced in the 3 years. I had been filing reports into their committee system. People spoke with genuine honesty about what had failed and why. A senior Ithari delegate, speaking in a way that I could tell was costing her something politically, said plainly and without qualification that the damage to Ithari space and the complete loss of the Kithra home system could have been significantly reduced if the Conclave had moved 2 years earlier. She did not say might have been reduced. She said could have been as a statement of fact, and the room was quiet when she finished. When they called on me to speak, I walked to the presentation floor with the folder, 900 pages, the original printed copy, the same physical object I had carried to this room 3 years ago. I had kept it through everything that followed. Physical objects hold a kind of weight that data files do not, and I needed the weight of this one. I put the folder on the presentation table. I did not open it. I said everything that needed to be said is already in this document. It was filed with Committee 7C 3 years ago. I sat down. The silence that followed lasted long enough to mean something. Cadden stood up. He was no longer junior delegate from a small species. 3 years of careful, persistent work. Inside the conclave's formal and informal structures had moved him to his species senior chair, and he stood differently now, not with more confidence because he had always had a quiet and genuine confidence, but with the specific quality that authority adds to a person who is using it carefully and for reasons he has thought through. He proposed a formal resolution. Permanent Threat Monitoring Division, established with the authority to call an emergency conclave session using a single transmission from the director. No quarterly schedule, no committee review, no majority vote required for the initial alert, only for the authorization of a military response. The alert itself would be automatic and immediate, triggered by the division's assessment alone, with no additional approval layer between the assessment and the convening of the session. The resolution passed. Nora Grant accepted Earth's permanent Security Council seat at a ceremony I was not present for because by the time the ceremony happened, I was already at my desk in the new office. The Threat Monitoring Division had been assigned a facility on Felucca Station, 3 quarters from the conclave chamber, close enough to matter and separate enough to work without interference. I had the title of director in a staff of 42 people from 7 species, every one of whom had been involved in some part of the 3-year effort, and none of whom needed to be convinced of the importance of what we were doing. Gwen was my deputy. She told me the office was too small within the first hour of arriving, filed a formal request for expanded sensor array access before the end of the first day. And when I told her to keep filing until it was approved, she said she had already planned to. The request was approved 6 weeks later. I do not know if the speed was a result of the political moment or simply of Gwen's persistence, and I suspect it was both. Henry Cole remained at Earth Defense Command but sent the division his complete simulation library and agreed to stay on permanent advisory call. He and Gwen argued about detection methodology at least twice a month over encrypted channel. I let them work it out. The arguments consistently produced results. Cadden came to the office on our 3rd day of operation. He had no scheduled meeting. He simply arrived and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the monitor arrays and the live data feeds and the map of the outer rim updating in real time, and he was quiet for a while. The way a person is quiet when they are confronting something directly that they have been thinking about from a distance for a long time. You never stopped watching, he said. No, I said. He looked at the map. The report, he said, the 900 pages. What about it? I read it, a pause, the week after your presentation to the conclave. All of it. I looked at him. I believed it, he said, every part of it. I went through the data myself, every appendix and every model, and I ran the numbers again on my own and arrived at the same conclusions. I believed it completely. He looked at the map on the wall rather than at me. I was 29 years old and a junior delegate from a species that had been in the conclave for 11 years, and I spent the entire following year trying 4 different approaches to make someone act on what you had shown us. None of the approaches worked. I ran out of approaches before I found the right ones. He was quiet for a moment. I am sorry I did not find a way. I thought carefully about what to say to that. I thought about 17 years. I thought about 900 pages sitting in a committee file. I thought about Petra and 2 years of dark relay stations. I thought about Oren, the Kithra captain, and the specific quality of his voice in that open channel. I thought about the Callaway in the deep current and the people who had been on both of them. I thought about the particular cost that accumulates when the people who understand a problem cannot make the people with authority act on it, and about the different costs that accumulates when the people with authority do not take the time to truly understand. You wrote back, I said. He waited. Every message I sent, you answered. You read everything. You caught the rounding error at the 3rd decimal place and told me quietly so I could correct it before anyone else found it and used it against the data. You asked questions that showed you were running the numbers, not just reading the summary. You kept paying attention when almost no one else in that building was paying attention at all. I looked at the map on the wall. It mattered to me. While I was sending reports into what felt like silence, knowing that you were reading them and taking them seriously, that mattered more than I knew how to say while it was happening. He was quiet for a moment. It was not enough, he said. No, I said, it was not enough. We stayed with that without trying to fix it because it did not have a fix. It was simply true, and the honest thing to do with a true thing is to hold it clearly and let it inform what you do. Next, what do we do with knowing that? He asked. I reached over to the corner of my desk and picked up the object I had placed there that morning when I arrived. A piece of hull plating from the first Vreth vessel our teams had ever boarded for analysis. That had happened years before the Conclave acknowledged the Vreth existed during a reconnaissance operation at the rim that had not been officially sanctioned and that no one had asked permission for. The plating was scorched uniformly, black, cold to the touch even in a warm room, its geometry subtly wrong in a way that I noticed every time I looked at it, and my brain could never fully articulate. I had carried it with me from posting to posting across 3 years. It lived on my desk wherever I worked. We watch, I said, we build the cases, and we file the reports through every channel we can reach. We find the people who are paying attention and we make sure they have access to everything we know. We build the authority to act into the system itself so that the next person who discovers something real cannot be placed into a quarterly schedule and left there while the thing they discovered keeps moving. Cadden looked at the hull plating, at the geometry that did not quite resolve. And if no one listens, he said, then we make sure we are ready anyway. I said, that is what we have always done. We do not stop watching because someone is not paying attention. We watch so that when they are finally ready to hear it, everything they need is already built and all the work has already been done. He was quiet for a moment. There are 214 species in the Conclave. He said, there are regions of the galaxy we have no sensor coverage of at all. There are signals at the edges of our current detection range that we classify as anomalies because we do not yet have a framework for them. Yes, I said. The Vreth are not the last thing we will be slow to understand. No, I said, they are not. He accepted this the way a person accepts something that is difficult and necessary. He did not look for a way around it. He looked at the map on the wall, at the live feed of the outer rim, at the data, updating in real time across 2,000 monitored channels, and he made the decision that I could see him making, without him putting it into words. He stayed for another hour. We worked through the division's monitoring protocols, the alert threshold calibrations, the cross-species training program Gwen was already building with the same methodical aggression she brought to everything. When Cadden left, he shook my hand. He had picked up the gesture somewhere in 3 years of working alongside people from Earth, and said he would be at the next briefing. He has been at every one since then. I stayed at my desk. The station was quiet. The data feeds ran their steady input. The map of the outer rim updated in real time, and nothing on it was flagging above threshold. Not yet. I put the hull plating back in its corner of the desk where I could see it. I opened the data feed. I started reading. This is what the work actually looks like. Not the formal session in the conclave chamber, not the security council seat, not the resolution that passed with enough votes to carry, or the speeches that I have learned to sit through while thinking about other things. The work is the reading. The work is the watching. The work is being the person who cannot afford to look away, because the cost of looking away is paid by people who never had the opportunity to look in the first place. Some of those people were on the Callaway. Some of them were in the Cathra home system on the day the monitoring equipment recorded the end of all biological activity and broadcast the fact into empty space in a calm, automated status report that no one living could hear. Some of them were in Athari stations and ships that had stood for centuries and were gone in 41 hours because the people with the authority to act had not been ready to hear the warning when it arrived. I think about them, not in a way that makes the work impossible, not in a way that I carry like damage. I think about them in the way that keeps your standards exactly where they need to be. Their snorts names are not a burden. They are a compass. They point toward the thing that has always mattered in all 17 years and all 900 pages and all 3 years of the work that followed, making sure the next warning lands where it needs to land, with the authority to act on it already in place before the cost becomes something we have to add to the list of names. The monitor runs. The data comes in. I read it. I write the report, and it goes through the proper channels and through the new system that does not require a committee vote to trigger an alert, and somewhere in the network of people who are watching and writing and refusing to stop, it finds the people who need it. And those people are already positioned to do something with it because we built that too. We are not guaranteed to catch everything. We are only guaranteed to keep looking. The galaxy is quiet today. We are making sure it stays that way. Tomorrow, we will be making sure again. We will keep making sure for as long as there are signals coming in from the edges of the map and things out there that have not yet shown us what they are. That is the work. That is what humans do. That is what we have always done from the very beginning, long before we had a galaxy to watch over. We pay attention. We do not stop.